This is a three-part lecture series entitled Traces. It is a combination of three different approaches to the notions of tracing or traces that we make, that we create. It is a studio lecture. In other words, the intention of this lecture is that I'm making, and I'll show you images and videos and reflections on previous works made collaboratively around the subject, and at the same time provoking you to join me in some of the activities and some of the experiments in creating work and understanding how we create work collaboratively and how we can inspire each other to make work by exploring notions of mapping, the idea of understanding space in a certain way, mapping our borders, our boundaries, looking at what's inside the map, exploring mapping concepts, mapping our artistic ideas, and obviously reflecting on our own vulnerability within that map. Then looking at how we illustrate and activate this map. What does it mean to look into the unknown, making sense of the unknown, and trying to look at the undefined and figuring out new ways of tracing, drawing, and illustrating that which cannot be defined. And part of that is the third part of the series, is the embodying part. How do we immerse ourselves into it? How do we take action? How do we probe? How do we agitate? How do we build tensions between different spaces? And where do we see ourselves, our bodies, and our presence within the debate and within the ideas that relate to how our world is traced, how our existence is traced, and how we as commentators and illustrators and creators of this world that we're in have a certain responsibility and are searching for something. And so I'm hoping that this three-part studio lecture helps shed light on my personal process and opens up new ways for you to engage and participate. So you are in the studio with me. I'm here in my studio in Vienna, where I've put up one of the tracings of one of the projects made in Ústí nad Labem at the House of Arts, together with a group of collaborating artists and students. And I brought this map back here to have a look at, to engage with, and continue producing on top of it. And so this is an example of how I hope that this lecture will take shape in a combination of me explaining concepts, playing through ideas, and physically engaging and making. So just as your response to this process is unknown, given the fact that we're connecting digitally and you're watching me right now, I don't know what you will take with you from this, which exercises you will do, which experiments you will undertake, and how you will be producing in your studio. Just as that's unknown to me, I've also kept this lecture as raw and unknown to myself. In other words, I'll be working live, I'll be working unrehearsed and raw in the making of these three lectures. And for me, conceptually, this is a very, very important departure point. It is the point at which the artistic process is not about trying to showcase something and end up with a result that you can sell or that you can hand out to someone, but actually trusting in the space of the studio, in the space of the self-reflection and the making. And so what I'm hoping is, through this process of allowing us to share a studio in one form or another, that we break apart this idea of how we present the work and rather think about how we make, how we play, how we experiment, and what the value of these experiments are. What are their traces? And I guess, how do we make sense of them once we then want to package them and show them and present them to someone else? So see this process right now as a process, trust in it, and know that there are no mistakes that aren't worth it. This is a fundamental part of how I practice as an artist, and I really believe is also needs to be embodied in the way that we relay our information to others. Allow others to access that vulnerable space that we are in as creatives in the studio, and see what happens when that vulnerability is met with a certain trust and a certain relationship that is important to the process. So the act of mapping, to me, is very much about sense making. We connect dots, we draw lines between places, We try to get aerial views, we try to get side views, we map our world and understand our world and draw the lines that connect and interconnect networks, and all of these ways of illustrating that which is around us, mapping that which is around us, making sense of it, trying to orientate ourselves, is all about where do we position ourselves in relation to it? How do we make sense of it? And how do we create a way of capturing it on a format? So I've started to collect byproducts from different mapping sessions, creative sessions. Maps don't always have to look like mind maps or kind of charts or street maps, but sometimes an abstract form like this can represent a whole process and a map for someone. So this is a byproduct of a map made in a creative session with a group of participants, as is the one behind me. And what I'd like to do as a little experiment is for us to actually maybe think about finding objects and creating a kind of a mind map using found material. So I went rummaging and searching in a wood workshop for offcuts and pieces of wood that I could start using for something. Not quite sure what, but nevertheless they're here. And I'm starting to realize that parts and pieces start fitting together like really interesting collages, assemblages. And what happens if we start mapping and labeling different things in order to create new kinds of maps? So maybe as one of the kind of start-off exercises in mind mapping and mapping your environment and your thoughts, it would be quite good to try and find a series of things that you can put together, that you can collapse, that you can assemble in some kind of way, and then label and mind map around it. What are the shapes? What are the colors? What are the forms? What are, for example, the little dots that someone has made somehow with some kind of material onto this form, and how do these dots start to create new histories and maps and territories of an activity that we don't really understand, but that exist? And what if we start mapping our own ideas on top of this? So what I like to do in order to make sense of my own creative process is look at the found objects, look at the material that's around me, and start thinking about how I can immerse myself into that material by starting to reflect on what it evokes in me. What is it in me at the moment that I want to make sense of? What is it that I want to talk about? And so very often the mind mapping of an idea starts with the format in which you work. If it's a piece of paper, a piece of cardboard, a found thing like this that already has a shape and various lines, I find quite interesting if you start thinking about how these forms that exist can start to create maybe some three-dimensional maps. And by starting to play with this, you start realizing that maybe we're starting to create new kinds of territories and new kinds of maps that if you start considering what these things are that you're dealing with and how you can mess with them, maybe there's something to be said about the chance effect of something creating a new kind of image, a new kind of idea. And I'll show you some examples of mind maps that are very literal and very legible. And then there are those which are purely emotive, reactive, and experimental. And in this case, as you can see, I'm just playing around while I'm talking to you. But that very act of playing around while I'm talking is starting to create a different kind of material and language, and maybe something that in the future might refer back to this lecture or be used for myself as something that talks about the creation of a map while trying to explain how my process starts to do strange things. Anyway, I'm getting distracted by my own making process, but I just wanted to illustrate the fun of playing with material and starting to think about what happens when you start to explore the making of maps in a completely different medium. And then, once you look at this and you think about how to read it and how to make sense of it and impose a concept on top of it, you can start to think about these things as boxes with ideas, or territories, or areas of influence or play, or connected dots and interconnected concepts. And so what I'm really liking about this is that there's something quite playful with that. I mean, quite interesting if you start extending it onto your hand and seeing what happens when the map itself becomes part of you. So what I'd like you to do is find some material, go out there, explore what's around you, and then kind of see whether or not you can start exploring some kind of a mind map that it just allows you to respond to material, to connect it with each other, to think about its relationship, to then consider what its connection is to each other, whether you can then impose a concept on top of that map. But for now, let's just make some marks, let's damage some material, and let's see what comes of that when you start looking at these surfaces and what these surfaces can do and what these new materials can start to illustrate. And alone, the crinkling of a piece of paper starts to become a really interesting territory and map. So, keyword territory. The idea of a territory is a really interesting one. Someone once drew a map somewhere dividing a land, saying this is yours and this is mine. Not realizing that there might be people living across these territories, concerns and issues we have today politically. And then what happens when you start looking into this line? What if you zoom into this line? You forget that maybe that very line is actually not just a little line, but actually a massive space. And so what happens when we zoom into lines? What happens when we extract them and actually start playing within them? And what happens in that space in between? And so when we draw these territories or these maps or these constellations of dots, we mustn't forget that it's the space in between that really becomes that which creates the exciting tension that we want to explore. It's not always in the dots themselves, but in the things between the lines or the lines themselves, as I said before, zooming into them. So yeah, let's play. When we think about map making, the obvious one is mind mapping. The idea of articulating and drawing different ideas onto a paper to try to make sense of things. Here on the left-hand side, you see the work of Stephen Hobbs, who at the time, as a collaborator of mine for 20 years now, in 2001, 2002, was mapping our network that we were working on in making sense of who we are as an artistic collective and what we're going to do and how we're going to connect different things. Juxtaposed with what's on the right, a mind map of mine, which is a series of small drawings in response in 2022 to a dialogue with a curator and a philosopher, thinking about the ideas of what we want to explore. So here the two are very clear juxtapositions of something that's very literal, legible, and interpretable in a language-based way, and a network of connecting lines way, and the other one which is much more of an experimental feeling of a conversation and what it might mean. Yes, there are words on the right-hand side as well, and there are interpretations to those words, but the references that are being used here in trying to make sense of the conversation that was being had is much more abstract. And so what's quite nice and poetic about the one on the left that Stephen produced was that as we, as a collective, started to make more and more together, these layers of maps became more and more intense, and they in their own right became artworks. So mind maps and the writing and drawing and mapping of who we are is not necessarily always just for the form of making sense of things and having little notes that we can follow, but they in their own right as artists are processes and products that can eventually become artworks. So here what you see, this layering of these maps over years and years of collaborating together become completely new statements about a history and about a journey that we've been on. And they become artifacts and objects in their own rights. So for me, there's a really interesting play here between a map or a mind map that is legible and interpretable to then it becoming abstracted and eventually to being maps that are maybe all about an emotional response or an abstract response that language itself might not be able to hold. Here is another version of a mind map that becomes both a combination of keywords, ideas, notes, and then abstract responses to some of those ideas, a layer of experiences that bring the two worlds together. What I'd like to propose to you is to make two types of mind maps. Go ahead and actually draw a mind map like we discussed earlier of these beautiful moments of keywords that are interconnected, taking your ideas and spreading them across a page through notes and ideas that are clearly legible with connections and lines, and do a second one which is about an abstract process that you want to express in whichever form you like, whichever medium you like. Seeing the two next to each other and maybe even on top of each other becomes a really exciting space to think about how an idea can have both a literal and text-based interpretation and exploration, and then a very emotive and expressive one through a much more abstract mark-making. So try it, and let's see what happens when you put the two together and explore them in different ways. So I'm going to show you a few examples of a collection of people coming together and co-creating maps, or playing with objects and trying to make sense of who they are in relation to each other and what these objects are in relation to each other, and marking onto them some of their own thoughts and playing with them in a certain way. Here's some byproducts of some of those sessions that I've had where people drew different elements and landscapes or perspectives of places that are meaningful to them onto objects and then started to play with them. So let me show you a few video clips of the making of some of these and how they were used, to give you a sense of the dialogue, the visual dialogue that was created and the relationship between these that right now are shards and offcuts of something, traces of a process, but they were used to map ideas, territories and spaces. So you will see a few examples. One of them uses these wooden ones, another one uses the canvas in the background, and it'll give you a sense of how play and experimentation collectively in a space and opening up the studio as a space of co-production and experimentation can start to yield really exciting collective maps, something we can't do right now because we're divided by a medium and a screen and time. But hopefully by some of the activities I'm doing in the studio and some of the activities that you're doing in response to what I'm doing, we create a kind of timeless interconnection or a non-time based interconnection by co-creating maps and mapping ideas and concepts that are important to us right now. Here we see 6 participants meeting in a space, mapping their own ideas onto card, bringing those card elements together, building a landscape, and then drawing around that landscape and mapping ideas, themselves, the shadows, concepts, onto a communal space, and then starting to interact with each other, battle it out, try and see where their lines intersect, claim space, and just explore that area around them. What was interesting about this is that it ended up in a series of traces, but more importantly in concepts that we then suddenly shared as a group. In this experiment, participants from the Belonging to the Museum class of the Repatriates projects got together and were asked to choose an object and relay some of the stories and messages onto that object that they wanted to bring into the class. Mapping them out, laying it out, creating a new landscape, they were then asked and tasked to build an urban landscape or a city landscape that manifested some of their thinking and ideas, to collaborate on creating an environment. That environment was then interpreted in different ways. Everyone told their stories with a spotlight and started to create their own narrative. These individual narratives then became a soundscape that was then to create an urban experience of this mythical space of ideas that they created. Eventually, each participant had the chance to take the city apart and create these shadowscapes and immersive spaces through their city interpretation. So usually when I consider mind maps, it's notes with little words that interconnect and ideas that are linked. And those are very valuable to do, and I think I motivate that you should do that. And I think every artist should try it, starting with somewhere with an idea, a little line, adding another idea, a little line, adding another place, a person, whatever links to the concept and the thoughts that you currently have. But an alternative is also to start using your drawing methodology to incorporating that. So what I'm showing you here is an example of a mind map book that I created around a project that was merely an exploration of where this project could go, an idea that I was sharing, some notes, which I can try and decipher now, or I can also explore as a completely new object. So the idea that this ongoing Leporella, which as you can see ends somewhere, where the ideas maybe came to an end, or where the project found a different realization, is one way. And what's really exciting about playing with mind maps in a different way and layering them is that when reviewing them and revisiting them, you start reading them very differently. And very specifically, you end up adding new things to it. So this one that I'm untangling here at the moment is actually a journey that another artist, Paul Cooper, and myself undertook when we got to speak to each other in the studio, not necessarily through just creating ideas and sharing our practices as artists, but actually saying what happens if we go out, we forage for material, and we come back and then we collectively start to play with what that material could mean to us. And so what we have here is a kind of a summary of a journey of two artists in dialogue with each other based on collected material from nature, thinking about their relationship with the context and treating this little notepad as their mind map for future collaborations and understanding of each other's practice. And so for me, this becomes a really exciting format to actually have a conversation with another artist and see what comes of it. On Paul Cooper's visit to my studio in Vienna, we spent some time going around Vienna into natural areas, including a place where bricks used to be made in a quarry, and took some of the clay from that space and started to talk about this idea of finding earth and working with earth and understanding earth in relation to us as artists and makers. And as you see here, Paul busy sculpting something abstract, something that he wants to explore, and me note-taking and mark-making some of the conversations that we were having on the book that you just saw, on the reverse side of where we took our original notes. And so the idea of creating this landscape and this space within which we contemplate and think about our ideas became a really important exchange between us. This continued, and we started to bring in some of the other objects that we collected, from branches and plants to objects that we found on the street. And so as we're making, as we're playing, as we're exploring, you can see this little set that is created through the idea and exchange. Also, temporary objects were made, clay forms, marks on the table, and were part of the journey of getting to know each other and getting to know our context and drawing out potential new collaborations for the future. If I reflect a little bit on what happened here, I think the construction of this tower of ideas, these ends of the wood that one wouldn't usually activate, for me was quite interesting. It's not always necessary to explain what one does, but I think for the sake of our communication and our exchange, one-sided as it might be, it might be quite fun to understand that I'm currently contemplating how the material that I'm playing with can help me structure, layer, level that which I'm trying to make sense of. And the idea of layering and leveling these pieces of wood and actually making my notes on them is my way of reflecting and unpacking some of the ideas that come with creating a story, creating a narrative that helps me think about something. So in this case, I was clearly thinking about what I mentioned earlier, this dividing of spaces through lines, and how these shards that we live in and these moments of understanding that we have are actually interconnected. So one moment I'm a father, the next moment I'm a husband, the next moment I'm a teacher, the next moment I'm an artist, the next moment I'm something else. And so my existence, from brother to son to everything else, is actually all interconnected through a common thread, and that is that which one informs the next. And for some reason I got sucked into making sense of these layers and trying to connect them somehow through color, through mark making, and through some keywords. And then, funnily enough, I thought I need to put it into a space, into a setting. And so here we are on this canvas that you would have seen in one of the previous videos, in the making of a kind of a collective mind map. And bringing it back in here, I thought, isn't it interesting that I'm playing in front of the surface with this pile of wood that represents different layers of me and layers of connectedness. And I thought, let me see what happens if I so-called trace it onto this. And suddenly seeing it vertically like this, it almost looks like a building or like a structure of some sort, but at the same time it looks like a cage. So these are the way things are evoking new ideas. And it actually is drawing my attention very much to the other things on the actual sheet, and looking at the ink running down and thinking that, yeah, maybe some of this ink can start to help create more defined areas within this drawing that was made collectively. And what if I start holding on to some of these shapes in a more interesting way and actually starting to bring definition into this sketch that was made collectively, and start to create a context or a landscape that in itself becomes a new kind of map. So how do I reread the map that was once created through this collective experience with others, and how do I add something new to it? So what I'd like you to think about and do now is look at the maps that you've created, look at the experiments that you've played with, look at the materials that you've got, and think about how you can, for yourself, while you did something intuitively, how you can start to make sense of it and interpret it. It doesn't always have to be a logical reason for doing something. You don't have to explain why you use green, you don't have to even explain why you use the wood. It happened to be there, it's intuitive, and it was playful. But it is sometimes nice to step back and just think about it and go, well, why? How can I read it? How can I interpret it? And how does it have an impact on its surrounding? So if I do that. If I pile it up, if I change my map, it becomes something else. I might find moments like this wonderful moment from before that can start to bring in something new again. And so what I want you to do is rethink your map, refocus your map, tear it up, destroy it, put it back together, recontextualize it, reshuffle it, reorganize it, and see what happens when you do that. Maybe there's something completely new that is revealed when you do that, and something new to be explored. And so this is very much about making sense of maps that either we have drawn or that have been drawn for us. If you think politically, it's quite relevant nowadays, all these maps that have been created that have defined borders of countries, of communities, of religions, that a lot of our society is trying to undo or redo and make sense of and avoid creating wars. And so when you start relaying out, retiling, repositioning a lot of these maps, maybe something new can come of it.
Documenting perspectives and maps has been an obsession of mine for a long time. Redrawing them, remapping them, drafting them, breaking them up, and then reconfiguring them is an act of rethinking the perspective that we have on our context and trying to make sense of it. Here you see a large map drawing that was once put together as a perfect map that I took apart and tried to put back together. This futile exercise, an impossible task, became a really interesting exploration for me to think about the new territories and spaces that were being created by me trying to make sense of a map that I couldn't put back together. And it's this very act of mapping, reconfiguring, playing with the reconfiguration and imagining these territories and spaces that give rise to new intentions and processes. So when one then looks at these maps, can we read them? Can we make sense of them? And if we can't make sense of them territorially, then how can we play with them? So here, for example, maps of territories of conflict defined within the global kind of UN definition are layered on top of each other instead of next to each other and start to create a new map as I'm drawing and tracing this animation. The process of trying to capture line and being part of redrawing this layering opens up new possibilities. The map and the line start to play with me, just like I'm playing with it. And as it progresses and changes, I start realizing that there's something new that lies inside it. There's a new form that has evolved, and there are spaces between the lines that have to be explored. So here you see me drawing under a microscope that which could be lying between the lines, and then projecting it up on top of an existing drawing of mine. And so this layering and experimental process of playing with maps, playing with line, playing with territory is obviously one that echoes in a lot of what I'm hoping you would take with you from this, is that we never just make a mark. That mark always represents something much bigger than we even understand. And as we explore different media, these marks change. Their impact changes. Here, for example, the bleeding of the black mark over the drawing is for me, in retrospect, very evocative of some of the emotional responses to what happens in these borders and between these borders. Similarly, with a range of other works, the political, the complex, the aggression, the war and the conflict, and the stuff that happens in little zones that are framed by these black marks, which are the borderlines, are very evocative of that which represents conflict. Here drawn in Russian green, the maps reconfigured into fragile buildings, or projected directly onto a building and painted as a map in that territory. Similarly, my exploration of the demilitarized zone in South Korea, looking at that space between South and North Korea as this no man's land, as a space of division, which on the map is just one little line, but represents a territory that I'm trying to understand in the short study that you see here.
During the studio sessions in Ústí at Labem, the mapping and the drawing that you've been seeing behind me evolved out of a whole journey of experiments. We created worlds, and in the world making, created new maps and new ideas. So what you're seeing now are explorations of material without having any particular intention, and allowing our exploration, our playful way to create new worlds. And with those new worlds, obviously, come new ways of reading them, new imaginary stories and narratives, and new concepts for art making and collaborating. So as we reflect on our previous maps and on our journeys from this first session, from this first lecture, of mapping both concepts, ideas, and just pure expressive experimentation, it's going to be very interesting to see how we take it further as we take some of these worlds that we've created, these tools that we've explored, these marks that we've made, and seeing if they create a new insight into that which we don't know or cannot define, into new territories, and to give it some conceptual and contextual strength and weight with which we can then hopefully embody it in the last lecture of this three-part series. So in part 2, we'll be illustrating and activating the unknown, the undefined, and the space in between in an attempt at world and sense making in our current state of being. To end part 1 of this lecture series, I'd like to present 2 more films. They are from the same project. The first film is a tour through Tunis by a donkey and a tour guide. And the second film is a reflection on this by creating a map. It is a map that embodies an experience, and it becomes a representation of the first film.
The very important Punic ports of Carthage witness about the maritime power of the Carthaginians, who constructed and founded the first city here in 814 BC. We can see the military port, which is circular form, and from the other side you got the rectangular port, and both were connected through that canal. You can also see the marabout of Lela Salha, who was a holy woman, a sage, and recognizable with that whitewashed cupola. This was a holy woman which source and well is still venerated and worshipped now by women who go often to make a visit there. Now we are crossing the historical itinerary of Carthage, which is covered now with bitumen and crossed by cars. New monuments replaced the ancient ones. And we're going to cross all the coastal area from one side to the hinterland area, where you can see other places full and rich with history and heritage. In this area and on the top of that hill you can see the Cathedral of St. Louis, which commemorates the coming of King Louis, who was here under the Crusades and died in Carthage. But also that hill is a perfect example of the stratification of the different heritage layers, reflecting different cultural identities of Tunisians, starting from Punic times to Roman times and finishing with the latest times French protectorate and nowadays. The Roman cisterns of Carthage were provided with water through the very impressive Hadrian's aqueduct. This aqueduct was running at a distance of 132 kilometers, so it is one of the most important Roman hydraulic works ever built in all Roman world. Me as a donkey, many times in this country people laugh at me, but I'm also in the same time the instrument which was used during centuries for agriculture and for all kind of use of humans living in this earth. Looking from the other side, this is a nice continuation between cultures and religion, and shows about a high degree of tolerance and coexistence between religions in Tunisia. Driving the way from Carthage to neighboring area, the landscape changed completely with concrete everywhere. Chinese have grown also here like mushrooms, and we can see some of the results of this invading urbanism. Chinatown. Non-obstant that Chinese tried also to percute and penetrate the Tunisian economy with no big success until now, but they are still trying, and they will succeed in the future. Friendly people everywhere here, people telling me hello and other leaving me the place so that I can ride quietly in these new areas of the city. All cars slowing, some curious people looking to me, and I'm still wondering. People are building everywhere, new urbanism everywhere, Carrefour centers everywhere. Tunisians are starting to shift very quickly their way of consuming things and joining more and more what they call the new modern societies. Carrefour is the symbolic representative of this new wave of marketing that also killed many small shops, handicrafts. People now prefer to go buy directly in Carrefour as they find all products they will use in their life. All these areas which are now satelliting Carrefour supermarket center in the past were all agricultural fields where people were cultivating maize, spices and tomatoes. They were using to sell them on that previous narrow street which is now nearly a motorway. Today all the area, all the urbanism is swallowing, invading savagely the ancient territory of fields of agriculture. Here is the area of Bahr al-Azraq, which is located just behind the super Carrefour centers. This area also was nearly completely abandoned as it's neighboring directly the salt depression of Ariana. Today also, many houses are in phase of construction and some popular quarters also are growing everywhere. If in period of Punic Carthage, the areas of Bahr al-Azraq just behind Carthage, which was defined to be the Megara, it means the agricultural and gardens of Carthage space. Today, completely swallowed by this urbanism. We didn't learn from the way Carthaginians were organizing their life, their economies, and, of course, their imagination. Taking the decision to cross the desert makes us probably think about our current situation and also about the different or possible ways that we are going to undertake in future. This reflection is very important for any humankind so that we can apprehend and excavate our future life, our future landscapes. Excavate our future and founded the first city, the military port, which is circular form, crossing the historical itinerary Tuma and crossed by cars. New monuments replace the ancient ones. Their way of consuming things across all the coastal area more and more what they call the new modern societies. The symbolic representative of this people are building everywhere that also new urbanism everywhere, shops, handicrafts, Carrefour centers, they everywhere, find all products they will use in their life. That hill is a perfect example of the stratification of the different heritage layers, reflecting different cultural identities of Tunisia, full and rich with history and heritage. On the top of that hill you can see the cathedral with water, the instrument which was used during centuries for agriculture and for all kinds of landscape changed completely this earth with concrete everywhere. Looking from the other side to neighboring area, percute and penetrate with no big success until now, but they are still trying and they will succeed in the future. Today all the area, all the urbanism is swallowing, invading savagely the ancient territory of fields of agriculture. Previous in narrow the past street were all agricultural fields. This area also was nearly completely many houses are in phase of construction. Chinese have grown also here, like mushrooms also are growing everywhere swallowed by this in these new areas of the city. Didn't learn from the way we're organizing their life, their economies, and of course their imagination. Continuation between the cultures and religion, high degree of tolerance and coexistence, some of the results of this invading urbanism. And I'm still wondering about our current situation, the different or possible ways that we are going to undertake in future. This reflection is very important for any humankind, our future life, our future landscapes.